I walked into Thanksgiving dinner carrying a pumpkin pie I'd baked from scratch, still warm in my hands, and stopped dead in the doorway when I saw a stranger sitting in my seat at the head of the table, my name card gone, replaced with hers like I had never existed, and my mother-in-law didn't even look surprised. She just glanced at me and said, "Oh, Emily, we thought you weren't coming," while my husband kept carving the turkey like I was invisible, like I wasn't his wife of 6 years, like I hadn't just spent all morning cooking half the dishes on that table. And when I stood there waiting for anyone to explain, my sister-in-law leaned over and whispered, "You should probably sit somewhere else." Like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome, like I didn't belong in my own family anymore. And in that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it snapped. So if you're listening right now and something about this story hits a little too close to home, only if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is for you right now. Because I read every single one and it reminds me I wasn't alone the night everything changed. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 32 years old, and that Thanksgiving dinner was the night I realized my husband and his entire family had been planning to erase me from my own life. But to understand how they got that far, you need to go back to the moment I first noticed something was wrong, long before that empty seat, long before that girl smiled at me like she had already taken my place. I did not move right away because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I just stood there holding that pie, while the room filled with the sound of silverware and quiet conversation, like nothing unusual had happened. Like it was completely normal for a woman to walk into her own Thanksgiving dinner and find herself erased from the table. And I remember scanning the place settings one by one, counting plates, counting chairs, realizing there was no extra seat, no backup, no mistake. They had planned this down to the last detail. And when I finally looked at Daniel, really looked at him, I saw it. Not guilt, not confusion, just this cold, careful distance like he had already stepped out of our marriage and was waiting for me to catch up. I set the pie down slowly on the kitchen counter because my hands were starting to shake, and I told myself to breathe, to not give them the reaction they were clearly expecting, because something about the way Margaret avoided my eyes and the way Sophie kept glancing at that girl in my seat told me this was bigger than humiliation. This was staged. So I walked back toward the dining room and pulled out a chair from the far end of the table, the kind of seat they give to distant relatives or last-minute guests, and I sat down without asking, without apologizing, and for a second the room shifted. Forks paused midair, conversations dipped, because that was not part of their script, and the girl in my seat turned slightly toward Daniel, whispering something I could not hear, but I caught the way she smiled, confident, like she had already won something I had not even realized I was competing for. And then my phone buzzed in my lap, a soft vibration that felt louder than anything else in that room. I glanced down, expecting a random notification, but instead I saw an email from a number I did not recognize. Subject line, urgent account notice, and I opened it under the table, my heart starting to pound as I read the first line. Your access has been temporarily restricted pending verification. And at first I thought it was a scam. But then another notification came in, and another, bank, business account, even the shared credit line Daniel and I used for the house, all locked, all at the exact same time, like someone had flipped a switch, and I felt this cold wave move through me because that does not happen by accident, not across multiple accounts, not all at once. I looked up again, slower this time, studying faces instead of searching for answers, Margaret's tight smile, Sophie's restless fingers tapping against her glass, Daniel still not looking at me, and suddenly it clicked. This dinner was not just about pushing me out, it was about making sure I had nowhere to stand when they did, and I realized in that moment that whatever they had been planning, it had already started long before I walked through that door. And I was the last one to know, but what they did not know was that I had already seen enough to understand one thing very clearly. They thought I was powerless. And they were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. The food kept moving around the table like nothing had changed. Plates being passed, glasses refilled, casual laughter filling the space that used to feel like home to me. And I sat there at the far and watching it all like I had been quietly replaced in my own life. But I stopped listening to what they were saying and started paying attention to what they were doing, because patterns do not lie even when people do. And I noticed how often Daniel checked his phone without unlocking it, How Margaret kept glancing toward the front door like she was waiting for something. How Sophie leaned in closer to that girl every time I shifted in my seat, like they were guarding her, protecting her position. And that is when I realized this was not just a dinner, this was a transition. They were introducing her into a role that used to be mine, and I was expected to fade out quietly. And the more I watched, the clearer it became that they had rehearsed this. Even the way Margaret suddenly spoke up, asking that girl about her job, her family, her future plans, giving her the kind of attention she had never once given me in 6 years. And when Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm, controlled, he said her name like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there, and something inside my chest tightened, not from heartbreak, but from understanding. Because heartbreak means you still believe something real existed. And in that moment, I saw the truth. This had been built behind my back for months, maybe longer, and I had been living inside a version of my life that was already being replaced piece by piece. And then my phone vibrated again, and this time it was not an email. It was a message from my business partner, short, urgent, asking if I had authorized a transfer, and my stomach dropped because I had not approved anything. Not that day, not that week. And I opened the attachment he sent. My fingers steady even though my pulse was racing. And there it was, a document with my name on it, my signature, authorizing a shift in ownership. But I knew immediately it was not mine. The date was wrong, the formatting slightly off, the kind of detail most people would miss, but I would not, because I built that company from nothing, and I knew every line of every contract that had ever passed through my hands, and suddenly everything connected, the locked accounts, the silence at the table, the way Daniel would not look at me. They were not just pushing me out of a family dinner. They were pushing me out of my own company, my own assets, my entire life structure, and they thought they had done it clean, quietly, without resistance. And for a brief second, I understood exactly why they chose tonight. Because Thanksgiving meant witnesses, meant legitimacy, meant they could frame everything that happened after this as natural, as expected, as something I agreed to or deserved, and I almost smiled at the precision of it, at how carefully they had planned every step. Because the truth is, I would have never seen it coming if it had not all unfolded at once, if they had not been so confident that I would break under the weight of it. And that is when I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I placed my phone face down on the table, folded my hands in front of me, and let them continue their performance. Because if they believed I was already gone, if they believed they had already won, then they would not be watching me closely enough to realize what I was about to do next. And what they did not understand was that the moment they tried to erase me, they activated something they never should have touched, something far bigger than a seat at a table. And I knew right then this night was not going to end the way they expected. I kept my expression neutral and reached for my glass like nothing inside me had shifted, like I had not just watched my entire life being quietly reassigned across that table, and I let the conversation flow around me while I listened more carefully than I ever had before. Because people reveal the truth when they think you are no longer a threat, and Daniel finally spoke again, asking that girl if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, his tone softer than it had been with me in months, and she laughed lightly and said she felt welcomed, like she had known them forever, and that word landed harder than anything else that night. Welcomed, because it meant there had been conversations I was never part of, introductions that happened without me, decisions made long before I walked through that door. And Margaret nodded approvingly, adding that family was about knowing where you belong. And I almost looked up at her then, almost asked her when exactly she decided I did not, but I stopped myself because I could see it now. The subtle alignment in their body language, the way they leaned toward each other and away from me, forming a circle that I was no longer inside. And that is when Daniel finally turned his head just enough to acknowledge me, not fully, just enough to make it look polite. And he said, calm and measured, "Emily, we need to talk after dinner." And I knew immediately that whatever they had planned, tonight was supposed to be the reveal. The moment they formalized everything, pushed me out with witnesses, made it clean, made it look mutual, and I nodded slightly, not because I agreed, but because I needed him to believe I would go along with it, because the moment they sensed resistance, they would close ranks, tighten control, and I needed them relaxed, overconfident, so I lowered my gaze back to the table and picked at my food, barely tasting anything, my mind moving faster than my hands, replaying every detail from the past few months. The late nights Daniel said he was working, the calls he took in the other room, the paperwork he insisted on handling alone. And suddenly those moments were not small anymore. They were pieces of a structure that had been built quietly around me. And then my phone vibrated again, a third time, and I knew before I even looked that it would not be random. I slid it closer under the table and unlocked it slowly, careful not to draw attention. And this time, it was a notification from a private number. Not saved, not familiar, just a short message that made my chest tighten. Check the secondary authorization log, and for a split second I froze, because there are very few people who know about that system, fewer who could access it, and none who would reach out like this without a reason. So I opened the secure app, fingers steady, and navigated to the log. Scrolling through timestamps, approvals, cross-references, and there it was, multiple entries under my name. Approvals I never gave, authorizations tied to my credentials, but executed from a different location. And attached to those entries were internal flags, silent alerts that had been triggered hours ago, alerts that I had not seen because my access had been cut. And in that moment, the full weight of what they had tried to do settled into place. This was not just a family betrayal. This crossed into something far more serious. Something that involved systems they clearly did not fully understand, and I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not fear, but control, because I realized they had made a mistake, a critical one. They assumed removing me from the surface would remove my reach, but they had no idea what was connected beneath it. And I slowly locked my phone and placed it back on the table, lifting my head for the first time with a calm I had not felt all night. And I looked directly at Daniel, really looked at him, and for a brief second, something in my expression must have changed, because his hand paused mid-motion, his eyes flickering toward mine, uncertain, just for a moment. And I knew then that he felt it, that something had shifted in a way he did not expect, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, steady, composed, because the next move mattered, and I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was deciding what would happen next. The room kept moving, but slower now, like something invisible had shifted in the air, and no one could quite name it yet. And I let that silence stretch just enough to make them uncomfortable before I reached for my phone again, this time not hiding it, not pretending, just calmly unlocking it and scrolling like I belonged exactly where I was. And I saw Daniel notice, his eyes flicking down to my hands, then back to my face, searching for something he could not quite read anymore. And that was new, because for years he had always known exactly how to control the situation, how to guide my reactions, how to stay one step ahead. But not tonight, not anymore. And Margaret cleared her throat suddenly, trying to pull the focus back, asking everyone to raise their glasses, to give thanks, her voice slightly tighter than before, and glasses lifted around the table, including mine. And I watched her carefully as she spoke about family, about trust, about knowing your place. And I almost smiled at that word again, place, because they had spent the entire evening trying to take mine, and they still did not understand that I had already stepped into a different position entirely, one they could not see yet. And as the glasses touched, and the room filled with that brief moment of forced unity, I lowered mine slowly and set it down with a soft but deliberate sound, just enough to draw attention without demanding it. And then I spoke for the first time since I walked in, my voice steady, calm, almost conversational. Daniel, before we have that talk you mentioned, there is something I need to clarify. And the table went quiet in that subtle way people do when they sense something is about to happen, and he nodded cautiously, like he still believed he was in control, like this was just another step in his plan. And I turned my phone toward him, not fully, just enough for him to see the screen light up, the interface, the logs, the kind of information that does not belong in a normal conversation. And I watched his expression shift, just slightly, just enough to confirm what I already knew, and I leaned back again, giving him a moment to process, because the realization needed time to land, needed to spread through him slowly. And then I said quietly, "It is interesting how many approvals have my name on them today, approvals I never gave." And Margaret's hand froze around her glass. Sophie stopped mid-breath, and the girl in my seat went completely still, her smile fading into something uncertain. and Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the screen again, trying to understand how much I knew, trying to calculate what I had access to. And that was the moment the balance shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, because for the first time that night, they were no longer performing, they were reacting, and I could see it in the way Margaret's posture stiffened, in the way Sophie glanced between Daniel and me like she was waiting for instructions, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower now, more careful. "Emily, this is not the time," and I nodded slightly, almost agreeing, but then I tapped my screen once, a single motion, and said, "You are right, it is not," and I selected the contact that had already been waiting at the top of my list, the one I had not needed until now, and for a brief second, I let my finger hover there, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted them to see it, to understand that whatever came next was not something they could stop. And then I pressed call, and I held the phone to my ear without breaking eye contact with Daniel, and the room felt different immediately, like the air itself had tightened, like everyone at that table suddenly realized they were no longer watching a situation unfold, they were inside it, and the line rang once, twice, and then connected, and I spoke clearly, calmly, the same way I always did when it mattered most. And as I listened to the response on the other end, I saw the exact moment Daniel understood that this was not a bluff, that this was not something he could explain away or control, and whatever confidence he had walked into that dinner with, it was gone. The house is quiet now in a way it never used to be, not heavy or suffocating, just still, like a place that no longer holds tension in its walls, and I have learned to appreciate that kind of silence, the kind that does not come from being ignored, but from finally being at peace with your own space. And life looks different these days, not perfect, not magically fixed, but clearer, simpler. Mine again, the accounts were restored within hours of that call. The fraudulent approvals flagged and reversed before any real damage could settle in. And as for Daniel and his family, they spent the following weeks dealing with consequences they never expected. Not loud or dramatic, just quiet unraveling, contracts questioned, access revoked, reputations shifting in ways that cannot be undone once truth surfaces, and I did not need to stay to watch it happen, because for the first time in a long time, I understood that closure does not come from seeing others fall. It comes from choosing not to fall with them, and I left that night without raising my voice, without creating a scene, just walked out with my coat and my keys. And I remember pausing at the door for a second, looking back at that table where I once thought I belonged, and realizing I was not losing anything that was ever truly mine to begin with. I was stepping out of something that had already let me go long before I noticed. And that realization changed everything, because it taught me that your place in someone's life should never have to be defended, never have to be negotiated, never be something that can be reassigned when you are not looking. And if it is, then it was never secure to begin with. And maybe the hardest lesson in all of this was learning to trust my own instincts again, because there were signs, small ones, quiet ones, moments that felt off, but I explained away, moments where something inside me whispered that things were not right, and I chose comfort over clarity, and I will not do that again, not with my heart, not with my time, not with my work. And if you are listening to this and you feel that same quiet voice inside you, the one that tells you something is wrong even when everything looks fine on the surface, do not ignore it. That voice is not fear, it is awareness, it is protection, it is something greater than logic, trying to guide you before things break in ways that are harder to repair. Protect your name, protect your finances, protect your peace, because not everyone who sits at your table deserves a permanent seat in your life, and sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who forget your value the fastest. But that does not mean your value disappears. It just means it is time to take it somewhere. It will be respected, and healing does not come all at once. It comes in quiet mornings, in small decisions, in choosing yourself again and again, even when it feels unfamiliar. And I want you to know that you are not alone in that process, that there is strength in walking away without bitterness, in rebuilding without needing revenge, in finding peace without needing an apology that may never come. And if you have ever felt replaced, overlooked, or quietly pushed out of a space where you thought you belonged, I see you, I understand you, And I promise you there is a version of your life waiting on the other side of that pain that feels lighter, freer, and more honest than anything you had before. Thank you for staying with me through this, for listening, for sharing this moment with me. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is for you right now, I am grateful that our paths crossed here. And if this story meant something to you, you can share your thoughts, your story, or simply let me know you are out there, because sometimes that is all it takes to remind someone they are not alone. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the one thing I want you to take from this is simple: never let anyone decide your place in your own life.